Everweird, or welcome to Everweird, whatever it is that I say. Today I wanted to talk about how to play D&D solo using the old school essentials. I run a series where I am playing a mega dungeon solo. I am using a spin-off of these rules. I'll get into that, if you want to nerd out on that. But I just wanted to make my pitch for how to play it and maybe why you should play it with Old School Essentials. Old School Essentials is this: a complete game of D&D, and it is actually D&D, put together in a really easy to read, understand, and reference format. When I say it is D&D, this is literally these books from the 1970s and 80s. These are written pretty well, actually easy to digest this. Later versions got a little bit murky, and because they continued expanding into the basic expert companion masters and immortal sets, rules got a little bit more complicated. Options came in that maybe weren't clarified when you should take advantage of these options. This is sort of the basic and expert set. You may have heard it referred to as BX D&D. Gavin Norman came along and compiled all of these rules into the Old School Essentials. It is literally the rules from these books in an easier to understand format. You can see along the pages here that there's sort of a color-coded indicating which section, or maybe not which section, but indicating where various sections start. On the end pages are quick things that you need to know. And then within it, for example, everything is just laid out in such a beautiful way. Here's creating a character across a 2-page spread. Here are the ability scores across a 2-page spread. And when you get into characters and their classes, here's the cleric across 2 pages. The dwarf across 2 pages. I don't really need to go through everything for you to understand that this is just super well laid out. It has a great user interface. You can understand what's going on. The only thing lacking here that people seem to agree on is that there's not really a narrative on how this all fits together. That is a common criticism here. I tend to disagree with that because I think so many of us sort of culturally know what an RPG is, that when we come in and read this introduction and read new to role-playing games, new to old school games, this is going to summarize and give us more references to look up. I think this is all you need. I don't think you need this bigger story. I don't think you need a lot of words about that because you're going to find out how the game sort of gets defined at your table. But towards that end, I want to talk about how to play D&D solo using Old School Essentials. So the first thing I want to look at is the character sheet. This is a character sheet for Old School Essentials. And this is one of the characters that I've been playing in my solo game. This character's name is Virago. They are a fighter, or they were at the time of this character sheet. So let's start here, because I think this is what makes old school play ideal for solo play. And that is that on an old school character sheet, all of your answers to whether a character can do something are right here. For example, strength checks, although checks didn't come up that frequently in old school gaming, they will come up more frequently in your solo gaming. All ability checks work with a D20 roll under resolution system. So if I were checking my strength there, I rolled a 14, I failed because my strength is a 12. Saving throws were distinct from abilities in old school games. They were in old school D&D. They were specific to your class, and as you level up, these saving throws go down, whereas your ability scores don't really change that much over your adventure unless something extraordinary happens. But a saving throw is a roll-over resolution mechanic. So if I want to save against death or poison, I need a 14 or above. A 14, I saved against death. Likewise, your armor class or your 2-hit armor class 0 matrix, or your THAC0, is right here on your sheet. The best armor class you are likely to encounter is a 0. You would need to roll a 19 to hit that armor class. Just like the saving throws, your THAC0 changes as you level up, and it is specific to your class. Fighters get a little bit more bonuses to their THAC0 as they level up, whereas magic users do not. When you are solo playing using Old School Essentials, in that adventure, you're going to be given the armor class of any adversary. And using your THAC0 matrix, you know exactly what you need to roll to hit that armor class. Let's say you're fighting a goblin that has an armor class of 9. You need to roll a 10, natural 20, you hit it. That's all you need to know. So the answers are on your sheet. If you were playing a thief, thieves have different skills with different chances of success that also improve as they level up. So let's say you're a thief at level 1 and you want to climb a sheer surface, abbreviated here as the CS. Your number to hit, your chance of success, is 87%. You take your percentile dice and you want to roll under to get that. So at 36, I have a successful climb of 100 feet of a sheer surface. There are different resolution mechanics for the different things you do in old school D&D. Saving throws is a roll at or over. Ability checks is a roll at or under. Skill checks is a roll at or under. And THAC0 is a roll at or over. These are D20s. Skill checks are a percentile. If you're a cleric and you are turning undead, it is a case of rolling 2d6 and trying to hit your number to turn the specific kind of undead or how many hit dice of that undead, but you know the answers. So that's the first reason why I think Old School Essentials and old school gaming is sort of ideally suited for solo play. You don't have to worry about a DC that's hidden for you. And you don't have to sort of interpret things in the moment if you want to do a perception check. There's a fairness that comes in, like, is this a DC 15 or do enough circumstances warrant that it's a DC 12? You don't have to have any judgment in mind. If you wanted to do a perception and you say, hey, let me just check my wisdom to see if I would notice this, a 14 higher than my wisdom, I didn't notice it. Everything is right there. So let's get into how to actually play D&D solo with Old School Essentials. There are a few things that you're going to need to help you on this journey. First thing is that you're going to need some ways to track your adventure. One of the great things about old school D&D is that it is not as rules heavy as modern D&D Pathfinder kind of games, but it is procedure heavy. And it is not maybe as procedure heavy as you might think. Don't let it worry you. The procedure is not intimidating in that way. It is clarifying. Right in the front cover of Old School Essentials, you'll see the dungeoneering procedure as well as the wilderness procedure. So this tells you a sequence per dungeon turn. You're going to check for wandering monsters. Your party's going to decide the course of action. You, as a solo player, are going to decide on that, and then you're going to play the referee as well, or the GM. At the end of the turn, you update your time records, check your light sources, your spell durations, and you rest. A turn is loosely 10 minutes in a dungeon. On the Old School Essentials website, which is necroticgnome.com, you'll find this downloadable dungeon time tracker, which is very easy to go through and mark off every time you have spent 10 minutes doing a thing. So for example, searching a 10 by 10 foot area in a dungeon thoroughly should take 10 minutes. So if you do that for every 10 by 10 foot area, you're going to mark off one of these. This time tracker also indicates when you should check for wandering monsters and when you should rest. That's what the W's and the R are. The T represents when your torch burns out, because torches burn for 1 hour. Lantern oil burns for 4 hours. So you see 4 hours across here. There's a little L that tells you that if you've lit a lantern at the beginning of your dungeoneering and tracked straight across, your lantern is now burned out and you need to spend another flask of oil to keep it lit. All of these things make old school gaming so much easier to manage than modern gaming, because modern gaming is much more vibe oriented, and time is not as distinct and managed in that way. We montage a lot of travel. We montage a lot of things through dungeons where there aren't encounters. But old school play relies on all of these things to engage you as a player. And I personally find it far more engaging than modern games, because I have to be aware of my resources and my environment and my character's needs as far as rest is concerned. And then there are random things that are going to happen that disrupt all of those things. Like I was saying about the procedures, there are also procedures for being in the wilderness. So in the wilderness, time tends to expand. And in the dungeon, it contracts a little bit. And then once you go into combat, it contracts a little bit more. So when we talk about rounds in old school games, we're talking about a round of combat, roughly 10 seconds, enough time for everyone involved in the combat to do one thing, essentially. There's some movement involved, things like that. But this round is 10 seconds long. A turn is 10 minutes long. Likewise, your movement in the encounter might be 40 feet, but if you are not in an encounter and you're just in a normal turn, it's 120 feet. Those are sort of the common movements right there, unarmored at least, and without treasure. 120, 40, this is how Old School Essentials denotes your movement rate. These numbers can be intimidating. They can seem like a lot of data if you're new to this game and you're thinking, well, why don't I just have 30 feet like in 5th edition and I can double it if I want to dash? But this gives you real specific stuff, which I appreciate because so much of old school play happens in a dungeon or in the wilderness. And by dungeon, we don't necessarily mean a literal dungeon, but in a confined space, in an interior space. And knowing I'm not in combat, I'm going to move 120 feet in 10 minutes, it's very easy to manage. There are also procedures for those micro actions that you take in exploring a dungeon. For example, if you want to listen at a door, you have a 1 in 6 chance. So you just roll a d6, and if you get a 1 and there's noise on the other side, you hear it. Likewise, if you want to force a stuck door, you need a 5 or a 6. So I forced it with that. You get to add your strength bonus to forcing stuck doors. That is clearly outlined here in the end papers of Old School Essentials. I talked about rest during the turn. For 10 minutes out of every hour, you need to rest or you will receive a -1 penalty on your 2-hit and damage rolls. That's one of those resources you're going to have to manage. And it's noted on the time tracker in the dungeon that R tells you it's time to rest. It doesn't always happen right there. You can carry it over into any sort of segment of the hour. You can rest earlier if circumstances provide that, but it's just a cool other resource to manage. Searching a room, I mentioned the 10 by 10 area, takes 10 minutes or 1 turn, and it's a 1 in 6 chance. So again, you just roll. If there's a 1, you've found anything there. Same thing for traps. There's a chance of triggering, which is a 2 in 6 chance. I have put a lot of these things into a basic D&D cheat sheet that I give to my players. Everything I've outlined so far, your ability checks are D20 equal or under, your saving throw is a D20 equal or over, and your 2-hit is a D20 equal or over your THAC0. Likewise, I have the dungeoneering actions here and what are needed. I think I copied this straight out of the Old School Essentials player reference guide, which is also available on their website. There's a little bit of management as a solo player, but once you get the hang of it, you'll see that these things sort of fall naturally and help you feel like you are taking turns, almost like in a board game sense, rather than nebulously creating a story like you might do in 5th edition. I think 5th edition D&D, some of those other bigger games like that, they're narratively so expansive in that way, and so many things can happen that you are challenged as a player to come up with interesting stuff. Whereas in old school play, the interesting stuff is like on the sheet. It's the real tactical encounter and interface with the dungeon or the adventuring environment that you're in. Likewise, for procedures, combat has a procedure, and that is that you declare your spells and your movement. Then you roll for your initiative. Each side rolls a d6. When I play solo, I simplify this saying I'm going to roll 1d6, and on a 1 to 3, the adversaries go first, and a 4 to 6, I get to act first. The winning side then acts. If the monster side acts first, they check their morale, but everyone then checks movement, missiles, magic, and melee. That's how you go through. So that's how you are able to have, in old school games, side initiative versus individual initiative. In modern games, we have individual initiative, and spellcasters may get to act first, whereas ranged or melee fighters may act last, or in between, there may be monsters. It gets all jumbled up. This makes the initiative roll a single roll. My side goes first. My movement happens, then my characters that are using ranged weapons fire, then my magic users go, and last my melee attacks. And then last to that are the ones using slow weapons or like the heavy weapons. They all go at the very end of melee. Again, this removes like a cognitive load from you as a solo player. You don't have to think, what's the optimal way for my characters to act in this combat? Instead, you just stick to the procedure and they act in the order as is prescribed. On the monster's turn, you roll for morale. So at the very top of their turn, which can happen in the very first round or any other time that you think sort of narratively makes sense. I mean, there's guidance to the referee or the game manager in the book, but as a solo player, it's kind of up to you. But let's say the monster goes first. You check their morale before you do any of the movement, missiles, magic, or melee. You roll 2d6, and if you beat their morale, in this case this would beat almost any monster's morale score, they flee. So then you, as a company of player characters, get to decide whether to pursue them or not on your turn, but often you don't want to engage in combat in an old school game because it can be very deadly. That morale offloads yet another decision-making process that you might make as a DM in a modern game. As a solo player in an old school game, you don't have to decide, do the monsters fight me or do they run away? You simply roll for it. When you meet a monster, you will roll a reaction for that monster. Not only that, you'll roll the encounter distance at which the encounter happens. So if you're thinking of this dungeon time tracker and you come across your wandering monsters check, which is a d6, 1 in 6 chance that there's a monster, you roll a 1, so a monster appears. You as a solo player then, and as a group player as well, but this is where this helps the solo gaming is, I'm first going to roll the encounter distance. If I'm in a dungeon, it's 2d6 times 10 feet away from me. Let's just take that example. It changes for wilderness and waterborne encounters. Wow. This monster happens to be 120 feet away from me. So not only can it not get to me, or can I get to it within one combat round, I have a pretty good chance of hiding or moving on, taking evasive action at this moment. Then I get to roll a monster reaction roll, which is another 2d6. Again, there's another procedure for it, and a quick chart offloads that cognitive moment where you might think, what's the monster going to do in this situation? You roll that. I rolled an 11. It is indifferent and uninterested. Not only is it 120 feet away from my party, it's not interested in us. So although I have the encounter, I have the tools to tell me where the monster is and how it reacts to me so that I don't have to play both sides of the table as a DM and a player trying to determine what to do. Granted, specific dungeons are going to have specific actions. Monsters may attack you outright. They may be a prescribed distance away from you, but on those wandering monsters checks, you've got procedures to figure out where they are and how they respond to you before you take any action. I will say that one of the things I've been challenged with as a solo player is the surprise roll, because in most cases, the initiative seems to take the place of the surprise or vice versa. Characters and monsters are surprised on a 1 or 2 of a d6 roll. This can determine any action that's taken right before the combat round starts, but often as a solo role player, I don't find this useful. You'll see me struggle with it from time to time during my solo plays. But it is another tool that you have, again, to offload that decision moment that you have to make. So you've got all the answers to whether you can do a thing on your character sheet. You can download helpful tools like this to track your adventure. In fact, I make a whole bunch of these. I make my own Dungeoneering time tracker, as well as a calendar that has month names in it that are a little silly. I have a party tracker so that my main party is all on one sheet. I also have a Dungeoneering company. I'll explain that in a moment, but that's a party of one single class. They're part of my party, but they are one single class. So I sort of have the stars of the show who can be 4 different classes, and then the company that they're more than retainers. They're not retainers, they're not mercenaries, but they are a company, in my case, of fighters that go with me on the adventures and do a lot of the forcing stuck doors and taking those first hits. I also make an inventory sheet so that I can easily stock and restock the common items, torches, rations, arrows, and then I have sort of blanks for you to fill in here, as well as your coins and your treasure, things like that, your movement rate, if you're encumbered or not, that's where you're going to change that. This has helped me immensely as I go through and play this game solo. You will see me in my plays shuffling through these sheets. Perhaps it would be better in a book. I tried that in a notebook for a while. But for me, the tracking of it in itself, even if it's not perfect, helps me know where my party is, what time of day it is, what day of the year it is. All of these things sort of influence my solo play so that I can then get creative outside of that. And I don't have to be making up something at every second of the game. You know, I get to play the game and just record what is happening right here. I also have, I should point out, the calendar is broken into watches, sort of a morning watch, an afternoon, midday watch, and then an evening watch, roughly 8 hours apiece. This helps me in some of my traveling so that I can abstract travel in the wilderness and mark off how many watches it takes. That also allows me to do wandering monster checks once per watch, if that is called for by the adventurer. If it's not, that's what I do, once per watch. And I can track sort of the time of day, the general time of day. On my Dungeoneering time tracker, I fill in the hour right here in the circle so that I know roughly what time of day it is as I'm going through, or not roughly, specifically what time of day it is as I go through a dungeon. But I don't switch to the time tracker until I'm in that sort of contracted space of a dungeon or an adventure. So I've covered a lot of the notes I made. You've got rules in your Old School Essentials Classic Fantasy Rules tome. That's the other great thing. This is just one book. It is both player and game manager or referee guide. Everything is in this one book. If you're using Old School Essentials, you're not having to consult too many other things. Equipment, monsters, treasure, classes, species, everything is in here. You've got the procedures, they're in here. The reactions, they're in here. There's going to be an adventure record that you create, or at least I'm going to make the suggestion that you do create an adventure record. And I did a whole video on this and how I want to create adventure records. What I do, and it didn't come up this way, I had to kind of find a way to do this. I was variously mapping in other ways. Like here's a great thing. I tried to start making a Gunderholfen solo section of notes. Gunderholfen is the mega dungeon I'm playing. Here are some solo sessions. I started making notes, what I'm learning. Here's a rough map. This wasn't coming together for me. And then I moved on to putting various things on note cards, index cards, which I always keep around in any game I play to make notes on. And that got a little disjointed and messy. And what I settled on was I am going to make a fairly detailed map in this larger book. And then I'm going to label the rooms with what happens in them. You can see this, I had a lot of time because I did it after the fact. This was a rough attempt at doing it while I played the game. Here's probably one of the best attempts I've made so far, where I'm mapping the dungeon as I go through it, and I'm marking what happened in each room to some extent. So I know what happened there. Here's where I found the necromancer Quintius. Here's where we fought those 3 skeletons. These merchants were in this jail cell back here. Likewise, here's the Fey Queen's Grief that I played with another party, and our map through the dungeon, and I kept all the stats, the AC and the hit points for every monster in here. Those are my adventure records. You get to choose how you want to do an adventure record. Maybe you want to make a video of it. Maybe you want to make a recording. Maybe you want to journal about it. I think one of the main things holding people back from playing solo games is this intimidation with feeling like it has to be a journal that you're keeping about your game, that there is a lot of writing involved. I don't think that's the case. Even if I weren't making videos about it, I would probably talk out loud as I went through the adventure to figure out how my characters reacted. I would draw on a map and I would note that map. That would be the fun to me, is that part of it. I don't need to have a descriptive, long narrative journal form entry on everything I did in that game. I don't want to fantasize about dialogue that much. I want it to happen in the moment. I want it to be a little bit more quick and spontaneous. That's what I mean by you get to choose what your adventure record looks like. So I think this is a really important point. That's why I made it so in my notes here. I just want to emphasize how free form that adventure record can be. It can be whatever you think makes sense. Maybe it is a heavily annotated character sheet, and that's how you've decided to keep up with your adventure. Let me talk about some specifics with characters and how I do it. What I have come across is that I had the benefit of doing all of this publicly on a YouTube channel and getting a lot of feedback in the early days where I first ventured out with a party of 3 characters. I was managing each through a character sheet, through one of these. So I found myself flipping back and forth to find everyone's saving throws and their equipment, things like that. And they pretty quickly got hit and lost a party member through some poor choices that I made, but also because the dungeon that I approached was more dangerous than I knew it could be. There wasn't an alternative really that I could figure out to an encounter that I had, and the dice rolls went against me. And I had a dead character before I thought about it. I received a lot of advice on hiring retainers, hiring mercenaries, hirelings. These are words that come up when you look in the rules for the hired help in Old School Essentials. You'll find that retainers are not mindless slaves, and although they share in the party's risk, they do not act as battle fodder. Retainers have to be of equal or lower level to the hiring PC. There's a recruitment process that you go through and an upkeep process, and each PC is limited to a certain number of retainers that they can hire. I find that very clarifying and helpful in a group game. In a solo game, I think it's almost impossible for the retainers not to become combat fodder. You're going to go in there, you're controlling, let's say, 8 characters, and the hobgoblins start swinging their morning stars at you. Who are you going to choose, knowing that you're basically metagaming the entire thing? Who are you going to choose but your retainers to get hit first? That's sort of how it happens. Now, there are procedures for checking loyalty, the reactions when you hire them, things like that, and experience. But this feels like a lot to manage to me for not quite the engagement that I want from the help, Mercenaries are hired to perform specific services. They are not retainers, and they do not accompany characters on adventures. What I'm pointing out here is that as I played, I realized that retainers would be a lot for me to manage. I would have to make sure they were of a level below my party. There would be wages and upkeep. There would be these reactions, loyalty checks. And mercenaries weren't exactly right because mercenaries don't go on adventures with me. It already didn't make sense in the fiction that I would pay a human archer 5 gold and then I would recover 2,000 gold in a dungeon level. So I was looking for a solution around that. Old school games often had larger parties than we think of today. Today we think of an ideal party as somewhere between 3 and 5 players and 3 to 5 characters. But in old school games, they went up to 8 or 10 characters or even more, run by that many players. There were ways to get around this, ways to get around the difficulty managing that. Tables had a mapper and a caller. A caller specifically spoke for the party so that there weren't 10 voices sort of individually telling the game manager what to do. I wanted to split all the difference to that. And so I made up my own system, which is that I have, as I mentioned before, the stars of the show. I have a party of 4 characters of different classes. And then I have a dungeoneering company who are all of one class. In my case, I have 3 right now, fighters. That means they all have the same THAC0, they have the same saves. I did give them different armor classes, hit points. I rolled their hit points and their max hit points. They also have different weapons. I use the mercenaries table to sort of quickly define what that is. If they are an archer, they have a short bow and a short sword. This one happened to have picked up a longbow. And then my sort of the stars of the show, the party itself, they're all different classes. In my case, because I'm playing slightly different rules than the old school essentials, still an old school game, I have a mystic, a thief, a magic user, and a cleric. It started out fighter, thief, magic user, cleric, basically the 4 core classes. And then my company were all fighters. This simplifies it. So all the main skill checks and things like that are done by my main party. Forcing doors, guarding the party, taking hits. Those are the fighters. Those are the ones that really do the dangerous work and handle the brute physical part of it. I think there's a great thing to do here, which is maybe your dungeoneering company is all elves. Maybe they're all dwarves. They're all halflings. They could be all thieves. What's important is that they're all one class, and then you've got this sort of unit to move with you as a solo player and a more diverse party where you can concentrate on role playing. I think personalities have emerged in my dungeoneering company, but not as much as in my dungeoneering party. I think this is a great system. If it works for you, great. If not, no worries. All of these sheets that I've created, I'll provide a link to. They're downloadable on my itch for whatever you want to pay or not pay for them. It's just free to use. But you can see from this, I've sort of condensed everything I need to know about a character. So they still have individual scores and saves. They have individual XP, and characters in old school games level up at different amounts of XP. So my party pretty quickly became diverse and of different levels. I think I've got a level 3, a level 1, a level 2, and a level 2. In my dungeoneering company, they level up together. What I do is I split the XP. Let's say I've got 4 characters and 3 company members. So I've got 7, let's say I get 700 XP. I divide that by 7. Obviously, it's 100 XP per person. I give each of them 100, and then I give the company 100. And they all level up together. So when this hits the next increment of a fighter's level up, they all become a fighter level 2. The hit die is the same for all my fighters. And additionally, I've added this stat for recruiting. Every time I go into an adventure and successfully return, this goes up by 1 to a maximum of +4. Every time I go into an adventure and I lose a character, whether from the company or the party, this goes down by 1 to a minimum of -4. Then when I go to recruit a new member of this company, a fighter, I roll the retainer reaction roll, which is whether they accept or refuse the offer that I'm giving them, and I add this modifier to it. The more I venture out and do dangerous stuff and lose company members, the worse chance I have of recruiting people. This basically is a charisma modifier according to the rules, but because I'm doing it as the company, I wanted to simplify it and just have a single modifier. In other words, Halit's charisma doesn't matter in this case because Halit could perish in the next adventure, but the recruiting reputation of the company remains, whatever it is in that instance when they go to hire during downtime. Then when they make that attempt to hire during downtime and fail, that's the only attempt that they get during downtime. They then have to go out, hopefully successfully return in order to modify this recruiting number and have better odds at recruiting on the next downtime. These sheets kind of show you my preferences to how I run a solo game. I think they capture the spirit of the old school game of D&D while simplifying a couple of decisions, because to me, so much of this, what is important, is offloading that cognitive weight that I've mentioned. Like, you as a solo player don't need to be trying to play both a player and a dungeon master and trying to decide what's fair, what is metagaming, how do I do something interesting that impacts the player characters in this way, even though I know I'm doing it. You want to offload as much of that as possible. You want to have a company of fighters or dwarves or whatever they are that acts as one unit when doing things in the dungeon. And then you want characters like this that are going to give you moments to role play and ways to change decisions according to their quirkier stats. So you're not moving everyone as a total unit, but you've got sort of prescribed limits to what everyone can do. One thing I would suggest if you are new to this is, again, just go to Necrotic Gnome, print out their rogues gallery of PCs. These are pre-made characters of every class and every alignment for each class. Although I don't have them all printed out with me, you'll see here the chaotic ones for the dwarf, cleric, and magic user. Here's a lawful dwarf and a chaotic elf. These are quick, ready-to-play characters that you can use right now. I have used them to fill in when I was in the middle of a session and didn't want to roll up a character. But rolling up a character is so fast in old school D&D. I believe I've got another video on that if you want to watch it. Okay, so that brings us to the adventures, which are already ready for you. And this is what brought me to solo gaming, solo RPGing in the first place, is that I was accumulating these adventures, reading them, thinking they looked so fun, and knowing there's always a scheduling issue with other people. There's always a challenge of organizing that time. And I was accumulating adventures more quickly than I was able to schedule sessions to play those adventures. These adventures are ready to go. So first of all, you can start with the adventure anthologies from Old School Essentials themselves. These have really great maps, really great references, and they are annotated in that same clear, easy to understand way that I think you can pick them up and run them without spoiling yourself on what's going to happen. Because of this sort of bullet point and just this really clear and concise way of describing rooms, you can feel this thrill of discovery as you go through it without it feeling too much of like a choose your own adventure game where you're going to turn to another page and just find out whether you lived or died. This is going to give you enough places to make choice, enough information without like spoiling you to the whole thing. I think there's a real genius in an old school adventure that's designed well, where you get to make up the details that are not on the page, if that makes sense. One thing I do when it comes to traps like this is I do rely on ability checks to, if I think, well, how would my character have figured out this puzzle? You know what? I'm going to take the most intelligent one and roll an intelligence check, and we'll just see if they make it or not. In the same spirit, I have a yes or no die that I use for a lot of decisions. I just ask a simple question. Would these monsters have closed this door after they went down that hallway? And I roll and say, yes, they did. That way I can offload that decision-making process. But yeah, anyway, the adventures are ready-made for you. And in the adventure anthology, they are at least broken up by the levels of your characters that are appropriate. A level 1 to 3, a level 2 to 3, a level 3, and a level 9 plus hex crawl. So these are just 4 great adventures in this book. 4 great adventures in this book. Same thing. If you've watched my channel, I've played through at least 3 of these. But then there are longer old school adventure scenarios that are just as great. I think the Incandescent Grottos is great. I've not played it as a solo player, but I have run players through it. I think it's absolutely wonderful. There's a tie-in called The Hole in the Oak, which I think would be similarly good to run through as a solo player or as a group if you're taking new players to old school D&D. These are awesome. But then there's the dungeon, mega dungeon. There's adventures in all of these carcass crawlers. There's the ruins of Castle Gygar. These are all dungeons that you can simply pick up, open up, read the brief descriptions, and just start walking your characters through that. So I think that hopefully ties everything together as you look at these adventures and how clear the maps are, how quick the descriptions are, and how they don't spoil everything that's going on. This is not a case of modern adventures where there's more narrative than there is direction and bullet points. The format of these is so important to their ability to bring to the table, as well as to play, like to a table of other players, as well as to play solo, because you can get enough. And what I want to point out from these adventures that is important in like another video I did on emergent narrative in old school games is that because things are not completely written out and described in long form, you have opportunities for role play and story to emerge from this. So you as a solo player are going to start finding these opportunities to go, well, how would my particular characters react to this glowing fungus? You can spend all the time you want investigating that and building up a story around it, how it affects your party. To me, that's where the creative bits of solo role-playing come in, and not, am I staying on the rails of this adventure? Am I going to find Strahd at the end of it and be able to defeat them? That's not what old school play is about, and that's not what solo RPGs should be about, in my estimation. I'll tack onto that too, that I think there's a lot of games in the solo role-playing space that rely on you making up your own adventure, whether it's through tables and game emulators, Oracle decks, all these things that are telling you to start mapping your adventure. I think that's great. That's awesome. That is a thing I do. I've not made videos about it. I haven't gotten into it too deep, but it is something that is different from the experience I wanted to find as a solo role player and why I chose to use BX D&D or Old School Essentials. For me, I want to play the adventures I already own, as I indicated. I also don't want to burn all this energy having to make decisions all along the way. I want it to feel like a game. I want decisions like monster reactions, monster distances, NPC reactions. This is all out of my hands. Yes, no questions. This is all offloaded from me so that I can enjoy the game and don't have to think of it as an exercise in like burning those carbohydrates in my brain to keep thinking up story details or how things connect. To me, I'm just piecing together the things that are already bulleted in the dungeon. And that gives me all that space to roleplay characters and let a story appear out of the adventure I'm already on. And in my mind, that experience of letting the story emerge from the adventure you're on, instead of having the story happen to your characters, that is the biggest difference between old school D&D play and modern D&D play. And that's why I'm like firmly into this older style of play right now, so that I can play with friends or play solo games and find that story in that material without having to come up with paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff. And I guess I should end on one huge thing that I think about playing solo role-playing games, which is don't use AI. This is such a frustrating point to me in discussions I see online around solo role-playing. People are constantly asking, can I use a generative AI tool to work as a game manager for my solo role-playing? Kinda, maybe, you probably could. But what is the point? The whole point of playing solo games and playing D&D, in my opinion, certainly in my specific experience, is for me to enjoy and practice and grow my human creative intelligence, and not to rely on artificial intelligence to tell me what's exciting or adventurous. I don't want to sit and stare at a computer. I want to look at paper and physical dice. I want to draw things on paper. I want to have this creative experience as I do it, whether I'm GMing a game for friends or whether I'm playing a game solo. I don't think AI is the answer to that. I think what we're searching for in this hobby is interaction and engagement with other human intelligence. If you want to play with artificial intelligence, just play a video game. If you're already staring at a screen, go ahead and do that. But that's not going to give you the same satisfaction and the same creative experience that doing this on your own with your own human intelligence can do. And with that, I think I'll sign off. I talked way longer than I thought I would about old school essentials and role playing with OSE. Hopefully it's condensed in the description enough and you watch this whole video. But I will see you in my next solo session.